The Alpha's legs buckled beneath the weight of its wounds. Blood, dark and viscous, pooled around its massive form as it collapsed among the shattered remains of what had once been a city. The Crethean war leader had fought for 3 days without rest, defending the evacuation ships as they fled the dying world. Now, with the last vessel gone and the sky burning orange with atmospheric collapse, it had nothing left. The Alpha's 6 eyes dimmed as it prepared for the end. At least its pack had survived. At least the Cubs were safe aboard the colony ship, traveling toward the Andromeda relay with the other survivors. Except they weren't. Through the haze of pain, the Alpha heard something impossible, a soft mewling cry that pierced through the rumbling of tectonic destruction. Its hearts lurched. That was Kessa's voice, its youngest cub. The sound came from somewhere in the rubble ahead, beyond a collapsed transit tower. The Alpha tried to rise but couldn't. Its hind legs were shattered, its breathing shallow. It had failed. After everything, it had failed to protect them all. Then it saw the human. The creature was small by Crethean standards, barely reaching the Alpha's shoulder even when standing. It wore tattered remnants of what might have once been an environmental suit, now scorched and torn beyond recognition. The human was covered in ash, bleeding from a dozen wounds, and moving with the distinctive limp of someone who should have stopped hours ago. But it hadn't stopped. In the human's arms, wrapped carefully in what looked like emergency thermal blankets, were 3 Crethean cubs, Kessa and her siblings. The human staggered under their weight. Each cub massed nearly 40 kilograms, but it kept moving step by agonizing step toward where the Alpha had fallen. The Alpha had heard stories about humans. Every species in the Galactic Assembly had. They were the newcomers, the strange primates from a death world who had clawed their way into space through sheer stubborn refusal to accept their limitations. Humans weren't the strongest or the fastest or the smartest, but they had something else, something the other species struggled to quantify. They called it persistence. The human reached the Alpha and gently set the cubs down. Kessa immediately crawled toward her parent, crying in relief. The human swayed on its feet, then dropped to one knee, breathing hard. It reached up and pulled off its helmet, revealing a face covered in soot and blood. Female, the Alpha thought, though it was difficult to tell with their species. Found them. In the shelter, the human gasped, her voice raw. Thought the ships. Took everyone. The Alpha stared. This human had stayed behind, had searched through kilometers of burning ruins while the world collapsed around her, looking for survivors when any rational being would have fled. And she had found what the Alpha itself could not protect. Why? The Alpha's translator struggled to convey the depth of its confusion. Your evacuation shuttle. You missed it for cubs not your own. The human coughed, spitting blood. She looked down at the cubs, then back at the Alpha with something that might have been a smile. Heard them crying. Couldn't just leave them. It was such a simple statement, such a human statement. The Alpha had studied their species during the War Council meetings, trying to understand the allies who had volunteered to help defend Crethean colonies from the swarm. Humans had no strategic interest here. No trade agreements, no territorial claims. They had simply shown up when the Crethean Assembly sent out a distress call, because someone needed help, because they heard the crying. The ground shook violently. A massive fissure opened 300 meters away, belching superheated gas into the atmosphere. They had minutes, perhaps less. The human looked up at the sky, then back at the Alpha. There's an emergency beacon, she said, pulling a device from her belt. Old mining outpost 2 kilometers east. Has a hardened shelter. Might survive long enough for rescue. I cannot walk, the Alpha said, feeling shame burn through its chest. Leave me. Take the cubs. The human's expression hardened. She stood, wobbling slightly, and grabbed one of the Alpha's massive forelimbs. Not how we do things. What followed would be recorded in the rescue logs and later in the Assembly's archives as biologically improbable. The human, who massed perhaps 60 kilograms, somehow levered the 200-kilogram Alpha onto a piece of debris and began pulling. When that failed, she found twisted metal beams and created a crude sledge. She loaded the cubs around their parent, talking to them constantly in soothing tones they couldn't understand but that somehow calmed them anyway. Then she pulled. Meter by meter, the human dragged the Alpha and its cubs through hell. She pulled through fires that melted her remaining suit material. She pulled across chasms using rubble as bridges. When a building collapsed in their path, she spent 20 precious minutes finding another route. She never stopped. She never quit. The Alpha watched in awe and growing horror as the human's body began to fail. Humans, it knew, released stress hormones in emergencies. Adrenaline, cortisol that allowed them to push beyond normal limitations. But there were limits even to that. The Alpha could see the human's muscles tearing, her hands bleeding, her body shutting down piece by piece. Still, she pulled. Why? The Alpha whispered again as they neared the outpost. Why destroy yourself for us? The human didn't answer immediately. She dragged them the final meters into the outpost's shelter, a reinforced bunker half buried in ash. Only then did she collapse against the wall, chest heaving. When I was young, she finally said, my settlement got hit by raiders. Bad ones. We sent out a distress call. Didn't expect anyone to come. We were nobody, just farmers on a frontier world. She coughed again. But someone came. Turian peacekeepers. They fought for us. 3 of them died protecting people they'd never met. She looked at the Alpha with eyes that held depths of memory and pain. They taught me something. Being strong isn't about being the biggest or the toughest. It's about deciding that some things matter more than your own survival. It's about hearing someone cry and refusing to walk away, even when walking away makes sense. The human's eyes closed. So yeah, couldn't just leave them. The rescue ship arrived 17 hours later, guided by the beacon signal. They found the Alpha and its cubs alive in the shelter, wrapped in emergency blankets. They found the human, barely clinging to life, her body broken but her mission complete. The Alpha would spend years trying to understand what drove that human to do what she did. It would study human history, human psychology, human culture. It would learn about their wars and their heroes, their tragedies and their triumphs. It would discover that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their tactics. It was their absolute, stubborn, irrational refusal to accept that something couldn't be done, simply because it was impossible. Years later, when the Alpha's cubs were grown and serving as ambassadors to the human worlds, they would tell the story of the human who carried them through the apocalypse. They would speak of her with reverence the way one speaks of legends, because that's what humans were, the Alpha came to understand. They were the species who heard crying in the darkness and ran toward it instead of away. They were the ones who fell to their knees, broken and bleeding, and still found the strength to stand one more time. They were humanity, and the galaxy would never be the same.